Hello. Um, this is lesson 5 on content analysis. This is going to be the last lesson before the midterm. Okay? So make sure that for the midterm you've got all of this material down, including anything that, any corresponding readings as laid out in the syllabus. As I mentioned, the midterm is going to be a combination of multiple choice, true, false, short answer, and a longer kind of essay question. It's a timed exam. It's online. I've never done this before, and I'm assuming that some of you or most of you have not done this before, but basically it's done through Canvas. You'll get like a link or whatever. You go in there, and then everything's timed. So question number 1 comes up, you'll have like whatever 30 seconds to answer it if it's multiple choice. True, the short answer you might have a little bit more time, and then the essay, which is, like I said before, kind of an application question, not really a traditional essay, but you'll have more time for that. But so you don't have a ton of time. Um, it'll be probably an hour and 15 minutes. And you'll just have to go in on the day of the exam. It'll just be open. The exam will be open. You'll have to finish it, I think, before whatever that evening, basically. And I'll email you and let you know like the deadline. But you'll have some flexibility in that regard. So, anyways, this is the lesson on content analysis. And by now you already kind of know a little bit about content analysis. You've read a content analysis, and I have intentionally, by design, talked about content analysis on a couple of different occasions. I've explained some of the basics to you, so a lot of this is going to be review for you. I kind of have to do that because you need that basic information in order to do the article review assignment. So first of all, before I get into content analysis again, let me just remind you about some of the differences between qualitative methods and quantitative methods. So I would ask you a little quiz question right now if we were in class. Is content analysis a quantitative or a qualitative method? Your answer is? The answer is quantitative method. You should know that by now. Content analysis is one of the 3 primary quantitative methods in our field: content analysis, surveys, and experiments. They all produce, as it says here, numerical data. They're concerned with counting stuff up, okay? Qualitative data are very different. Qualitative studies are more in depth. They take place in natural settings as opposed to the laboratory, right? Usually because you're going in so much detail, you take smaller samples. It makes generalization very difficult, which is why qualitative research is generally weak on external validity. Okay? This is just a review. You should know all this already. This has been covered in the readings, and I've talked about it in some of the lectures. In quantitative methods, we are explicitly interested in generalizing. We want to generalize. We're gonna like I said, we're gonna produce numerical data. We have the large samples, which makes generalization possible. I want to give you an example of how quantitative methods and qualitative methods can both be used, are both valid. I'm not trying to suggest that one is better than the other. In our field, we have quantitative researchers, we have qualitative researchers. Sometimes they don't get along. Personally, if you ask me, I think both are valuable, and I do both. I've published qualitative studies, and I've also published quantitative studies. And I just think there's a time and a place for quantitative, and then there's a time and a place for qualitative. So think about athletic performance. Think about athletic performance. There are quantitative ways to measure an athlete's performance, right? In basketball, you look at field goal percentage, right? How many shots does a player make out of a total number of shots attempted? How many points does the player score? How many assists does the player accumulate? How many rebounds does the player grab? How many steals? How many blocked shots? How many turnovers? There are all these stats, and you can look at them and you say, wow, that player is good, or that player is not very good. He's not doing much statistically. But there are also qualitative, those are all quantitative assessments. But there are also qualitative assessments that don't show up in the box score. Don't you hear that when you're watching sporting events, don't you? They say this guy, he's so valuable, or this gal, she's so valuable to her team. What she does not show up in the box score, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. The intangibles, you hear this all the time about, football players, quarterbacks. The quarterbacks do things that don't show up, the way they read the defense. The quarterback on a particular play might make a great read, might make a great play, and actually, statistically, all he did was throw the ball out of bounds. But throwing the ball out of bounds was good for his team because it maybe saved a sack. It prevented his team from losing yards, if you understand, football terminology. Or it prevented his team from turning the ball over to the other team, right? But yet, that just goes in the stat book as an incomplete pass. So you have to engage in the quantitative methods and the qualitative methods, and they kind of complement one another, the quantitative data and the qualitative data. It's the same thing in soccer. Some of you, I'm trying to give a diverse range of examples because some of you probably know football, some probably know soccer, some probably know basketball. But in in soccer, there's a particular player. He never scores goals, right? But he's really valuable to the team. Maybe he plays really good defense. I don't know a lot about soccer, so I don't even know the terminology. But he plays really good defense. He helps the team get into the offense, but he never scores, right? So anyways, people that analyze and assess sports engage with both of these kinds of data, qualitative data and quantitative data. This is why the coaches, after the game, what do? They look at the statistics, and then what do? They watch the film of the game, right? In football, American football, they call it, the all-22, where you can see the whole field and you watch every player. That's the qualitative assessment, because the statistics don't tell you the entire story. So again, try to know and understand the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. Get comfortable, and know when to, when it might be appropriate to approach something quantitatively versus qualitatively. So content analysis is one of the major methods in our field. It's defined in the book, or in one of the books, as a research technique for the objective, systematic, and quantitative description of the manifest content of communication. I apologize. So content analysis allows us to describe the nature of some content systematically, precisely, scientifically. Any content. It could be, there was a content analysis that I thought was really interesting that looked at presidential speeches, like the State of the Union address. They looked at all these different State of the Union addresses over a number of years and a number of different presidents. They examined the content systematically, counting stuff up, right? That's one kind of content. You could examine speeches. You could examine music, movies, news, whatever the content is. It's really a useful method because, again, it's very scientific. You're just counting the presence of certain aspects of the content. You're just counting to see whether or not they're there. And that's very telling, right? It's very useful to know what's present and what is not present. One study was interesting. It was looking at violence on TV, and they just looked at different shows across different eras and across different channels. And one of the things they counted many things, but they just counted the number of gunshots. You can learn a lot. How many gunshots are there on this show? It's very easy to count that up, right? Note, and I should say this until my face is blue, content analysis tells us nothing about effects. When you do a content analysis, all you're doing is studying the content. It tells you what is there. It does not tell you what the effects of the content are. A lot of students make this mistake, so be careful. Students will say something like, I did a content analysis and it showed that Fox News is really biased. Therefore, people that watch Fox News are really biased. It doesn't tell you anything about, I'm just making that example up, but if your content analysis showed you that Fox News is biased, stop there. That's all it tells you. It doesn't tell you anything about you can speculate about the viewers. You could say it may make them more biased and we need to study that, but don't say it does because you haven't studied the effects. You have to do a separate study, which would be an experiment, because the experiment is what's best to study effects with. And the reason why we can't say anything about effects is because messages are polysemic. That means they can be interpreted in multiple ways. Okay? You see something, I see something different. We watch the movie, and what happens? I have one interpretation about the ending, and you have a completely different interpretation. We watch the president's speech, and you love the president, and you're saying, "Oh wow, it's such a great speech. Did you hear what he said about this? And that was so great." And I'm watching the same speech, and I go, "No, what he meant was actually this, and that's really stupid," or whatever. So the point is, you can never assume. You can never assume how content is going to go over, because things can be interpreted in different ways. Messages are polysemic. Content analysis is objective. It allows multiple researchers to examine the same content and come to the same conclusions. This is possible because content analysis is systematic. As I said, what we do in a content analysis is the very first thing we do after we decide what kind of content we're going to study is we set up a set of rules. We set up a set of rules, procedures for coding the content. We set up a coding sheet on the Canvas site, and I think you should do this. I've posted a couple of examples of coding sheets. Go have a look at them. You'll notice it's just a list of a coding sheet is basically a list of questions. Usually the responses are multiple choice type responses. Somebody's going to sit and watch that content, or read that content, or view that content, or listen to that content. A coder. And they will sit there and answer those questions. Okay? And at the end, they're going to come up with a bunch of numbers. So it's systematic, right? It's quantitative. It's precise. It allows for statistical analysis, which is very nice. Content analysis mostly focuses on manifest content. That means outward content. But it can focus on the latent content, the hidden, between the lines content as well, if it's carefully designed. And you'll notice that those coding sheets that I've placed, those examples on the Canvas site, mostly manifest type questions, but some more latent questions that try to get at the latent meanings. And the difference between manifest and latent is important. Like if I said to you, hey, that's a nice shirt. Or if I said to you, nice shirt. Those are two. I'm not a very good actor, but you get the idea. In one version, I'm complimenting you. In the other, I'm criticizing you. I'm saying that's not a very nice shirt. I was just being sarcastic. So, if you just look at manifest, it said nice shirt. It's a compliment. But no, if you look at the hidden meaning, what was suggested, implied, it was actually very critical. Okay. Here's an example of a content analysis. I think the best way to learn about content analysis is to look at examples. So there was a group of researchers that wanted to study whether or not smoking had become more or less prevalent in the 1950s in movies. Okay? Pretty interesting question if you think about it. Right? Do they smoke more now than they did in the 1950s in the movies, or do they smoke less? So the first step that you have to take is, what are my movies? What am I going to watch? You have to do something that is, again, systematic. You can't just cherry pick. You can't just hand select movies, because then you can just find what you want, right? You might know that there's a movie in 1950 where there was a lot of smoking. And so you pick that movie. Because for whatever reason, you want to show that smoking is less prevalent now. So you can't do that. You have to do it systematically. You have to take some kind of a random sample. Maybe it's got to be apples to apples. Maybe you would take the top 10 grossing movies from the 1950s, or 1950 and 1951, and 2000 and 2001. That would be pretty objective, right? The top 10 over here and the top 10 over here. Okay? Again, you don't have to study every movie that was produced in the different years that you're studying, because random sampling is a beautiful thing. When we take a good random sample, it represents the population. Just like when they do polls of Americans' approval for President Obama, they don't ask every single American. They take a random sample. So that's what the researchers in this particular example did. They took a random sample of movies from the early 50s and then another random sample of movies from 2000 and 2001. That was the first step. The second step is they had to decide on a unit of analysis. Remember that? What's the specific component part that we want to analyze and examine? What do we want to talk in terms of at the end? Do we want to talk about the whole movie? A half hour or 1 hour? A particular scene? What do we want to be working on? Do you want to be saying at the end that 46% of the scenes in these movies did this or said this? Or do you want to say 28% of the movies did this or said this? In this case, I think choosing the whole movie would be kind of silly. Can you see why? Let's say one of the questions on your coding sheet was anyone smoking? Yes or no? Well, pretty much in every movie, somebody was smoking, so it's not going to tell you anything. That's not a very sensitive data point. I mean, it's going to end up saying that 100% of the movies in 1950 showed somebody smoking, and 100% of the movies in 2000 showed somebody smoking. So it might be better to take like the scene. Now you can say, okay, well, in 22% of the scenes in 1950, somebody was smoking. And in 61% of the scenes, I'm just making this up, somebody was smoking in 2001. So you can see the difference there. You have to think carefully about what you want to analyze, what you want to hone in on, what you want to focus on, what makes most sense. In this particular example, and I would not have done this, but they took the half hour. They divided the movies up into half-hour units, okay? And they studied each half hour on its own term. So that what that means in practical sense is that, you know, that little coding sheet, that list of questions? Pay attention. What you're going to do is you're going to take out a new coding sheet at every new unit. So in this case, they took the half hour. What they did is they watched a half hour of the movie, answered all the questions. Then they watched the next half hour, and they grab a new coding sheet and they answer all those questions again. That's how you do a content analysis. If it were me, if I were doing a movie, I would do the scene. Now that gives you a lot of units because there are like 20 scenes in a movie on average, but that's a good thing. You're going to have a really large sample, and that's great. So I've already talked about a lot of this. I've already talked about the example last time I talked about units of analysis for news articles and so on and so forth. But if you have any questions on units of analysis, let me know. We can talk about that over Skype or whatever. Sometimes students get confused by that. So just let me know. The next step, so now you have your sample, you've got your unit of analysis, now you've got to develop a coding scheme. Now I've been saying coding sheet. I want you to know what the difference between a coding sheet and a coding scheme is. A coding sheet is just a list of questions, right? The coding scheme is the questions plus instructions for the coders, okay? So for example, one question on this coding sheet might be, was somebody smoking in this unit? Yes or no? Or let me do it this way. This is a better question. How many people were seen smoking in this unit, in this scene, or in this half-hour segment of the movie? This half-hour section of the movie. How many people were seen smoking? Were shown smoking? That's a good question for this coding sheet. That'd be a great question. They had a question like that, similar to that. Okay. Your coding sheet is just going to have the question, and there's going to be a little line there, and then your coder is going to write down 3 or 7 or 2 or 1 or 0 or however many people were shown smoking. But your coding scheme is going to give instructions for that question. Can you think of what instructions you might need for that kind of a question? Well, for instance, your coder has to know, remember, you're not going to watch the movie. It's your coders that are going to watch the movie. And it's not just one coder, it's 2 coders, and you're going to do those inter-coder reliability tests to make sure that they agree that they're coding things, they're answering questions in exactly the same way. So content analysis is really detailed, and in some cases laborious, but that's what they do. So your coder needs some instructions on that question, because imagine, what if, so you're watching the movie, right? And somebody's smoking a cigarette, and then the director cuts out, goes to another scene, they show somebody else somewhere else, and then they come back to the dude and he's still smoking a cigarette. Does that count as 2 people smoking, 2 different smoking incidences, or is that just 1? The correct answer is it's up to you, the researcher. There's no right or wrong answer, so however you want to count it, but your coder needs to know. So those instructions would be included in the coding scheme, okay? In this particular study, they coded for people who were shown smoking, tobacco ads, and how many ashtrays appeared. All of these things were called tobacco incidents. You know, incidences of people smoking or showing advertisements, or how many. Think about why they would want to know that. Why would they count how many smoking ads there were? You could argue that that's really important because it's still sending a message to you and me, the viewers watching the movie at home or at the theater or whatever. Well, it's smoking. We're seeing tobacco, right, in some capacity. Ashtrays, like an ashtray with a cigarette on it. Nobody's smoking, but you're still seeing an ashtray with a cigarette. So anyways, that's what they coded for. So they designed the coding scheme. They put the rules in there, the instructions. We call them coding rules, decisions. Like you'll say, if the scene cuts out and comes back in, just count that as 1 incident, right? Or whatever. Or count it as 2. Okay? Next step is to actually do the analysis. That is, have your coders sit there and code the content and document it. You're going to then enter all of the data into a statistical program and just crunch the numbers. Make sure that you test for intercoder reliability, like I mentioned. You always want to test for intercoder reliability. Some people try to take a shortcut. They're like, you know what? I'm a good researcher, and I'm going to be really honest about it. And I know what I mean by all these questions, so I'm just going to answer all the questions. Don't do that. People are going to have doubt. They're going to say, well, maybe he's just answering these questions in ways that are going to make his study more interesting. So it's much more convincing to have other people read the content or view the content and answer the questions. And it's much more convincing and credible if you have 2 different people or more and have them basically test them to see that they're answering the questions in the same way. Because again, what you're doing is you're suggesting to people, you're implying that, hey, anybody else who comes and watches these movies is going to see the same thing that I saw, is going to find the same findings that I found. Because look, I had these 2 other people answer these questions, and they answered them in the same way. They agreed. So what are the odds of that? So in other words, your coding scheme is measuring what you're saying it's measuring, right? Once you've entered all the data, I'm doing this right now, in fact, in a study that I'm working on. I think I mentioned this. You enter everything into a statistical package or statistical program like SPSS or Minitab, and then you crunch the numbers, and then you get your results. The researchers in this particular case, in case you're interested, they found that there were 10.9 smoking incidents per hour. Oh, their unit of analysis was the full hour of the movie. I'm sorry, not the half hour. I mean, in my opinion, that's, with all due respect, I think that's kind of ridiculous. That's a really long, really big unit. On the other hand, it kind of makes sense because they're using ratio level variables. You know what that means? You should know. They're counting up in real numbers and real terms. They're not saying, they're not using an ordinal level measure or a nominal level measure. They're actually counting up literally how many times there was a smoking incident. And so per hour, per film, I guess would even work in that particular case. So it was 10.9 in 2000 and 10.7 in 1950s. That's not a big difference. That's not a big difference. And they did a statistical significance test to find out if those differences are statistically significant. I'm going to explain that, and you're going to want to pay attention. But I'm going to do that in the next video. And then you interpret the findings, you explain it, you write it up, and you have your study, and then you try to publish it. In the next video, I'm going to explain the concept of statistical significance, and make sure you pay attention because it's something that some students get tripped up on. Okay.